Chapter 1: The Collapse of Control. When everything falls apart. The illusion of certainty. Aria Vale had always built her life like a mason builds a wall, each stone carefully placed, mortar smoothed, edges aligned so that nothing could slip or sag. Her days were 10-year plans folded into tidy spreadsheets, her relationships parceled into predictable rituals, and her ambitions mapped like constellations she believed she had learned by heart. She kept a safe distance from surprise the way a chess player keeps distance from blunders, and in that distance she believed she had purchased a kind of safety, that assurance that if you pulled the right levers and rehearsed the right words, life would bend into the comfortable form you had sketched on the page. On the morning she was told she was redundant, the wall she had been building all these years did not simply crack. It collapsed with a sound that felt like the silence after fireworks, sudden and unnerving, leaving her inside an unfamiliar space louder than any noise she had known. The meeting with HR had been clinical in form and brutal in effect. The manager offered phrases, strategic realignment, cost efficiencies, talent redeployment, that were supposed to sound professional and impersonal, but to Aria they landed like a personal verdict. She left the building holding a cardboard box of her things, the small plant she'd kept on her desk turned brown at the tips from too many late nights, a photo of her smiling with Julian on a summer pier, and a nameplate that now felt like an ironic postcard from a life that no longer belonged to her. Outside, the sky carried the same serene blue it always did over the city. The world, indifferent, continued its circulation. It was precisely that indifferent continuity that made her grief more acute, because everything she had banked on, the identity of the reliable manager, the future she had written in monthly increments, had been withdrawn from under her as though someone had edited a paragraph from the only script she had been memorizing. Julian called her 2 hours after the meeting. He sounded practiced and thin, words rehearsed to avoid the jaggedness of truth. "We need to talk," he said, and when Aria asked if it could wait, there was a pause full of that exhausted, adult kindness he'd always shown. The conversation that followed was a fracture made of soft, careful lines. He spoke of distance that had grown like ivy between them, of different timelines and priorities, of love that had been brave but was no longer sustainable. He apologized, explaining that he had tried to hold them both, his job, their plans, the pressure from his family, and that he feared he could not be the partner she deserved. Aria listened as if the world had become a radio turned to a channel in a bigger house, muffled and slightly out of focus. Words landed on her like slow hail. After she hung up, the photo in her cardboard box felt suddenly like an artifact from another era, and she had to remind herself, first like a litany, then with the desperate repetition of someone practicing a new language, that certainty had been an agreement she had been leaning on, not a promise life had ever made. The panic of letting go. Panic, when it arrives, does not wear heraldry. It tiptoes into the body with the intimacy of a winter draft, then sets about loosening the closures you thought were sealed. For Aria, panic arrived as a clenching in her throat and a buzzing behind her eyes, a frantic machinery of thoughts that gamed out every possible scarring future, the unpaid bills that multiplied into mountains, the social self imploding when friends asked awkwardly about what happened, the project proposals already circulating in her head that would now have to be scrapped or revised by someone who would not know the care she had poured into them. She found herself back at the old habits, rapid emailing, forced optimism plied like a cosmetic, calls to recruiters made in a voice that tried too hard to sound steady. But the more she pushed to repair the scenario, the farther things seemed to fall from her grasp. Each fix burst another fissure. There is a peculiar cruelty in how the human mind confuses motion with mastery, assuming that frantic activity is equivalent to meaningful control, and Aria was not immune. The panic needed an outlet, and she gave it one by attempting to hold the slipping threads tighter. She began to micromanage the past, replaying conversations in search of the precise phrase that had broken Julian's love. She tried to negotiate with time, crafting new routines to plug the expanding void. In the small hours of the night, she would lie awake and argue with possibility itself, bargaining with the universe as if she could bribe fate with more effort and better plans. The irony was sharp. Her devotion to control had always been a defense against loss, and yet it amplified the very losses she feared, making them ache louder by her insistence upon never being surprised. There is a spirituality to panic that is often ignored in our hushed conversations about productivity and resilience. Panic marks the edge of what we can hold in conscious management and the beginning of an education the heart demands. For Arya, the education would not be taught in a conference room or a motivational seminar. It would begin in the raw ache of having to rewrite a life in mid-flight. The first, brutal lesson was humiliatingly simple. If you are clinging to the outcome rather than to the process of being alive, you will eventually be stripped of your illusions. Control, as she was learning, was never more than a thin veneer over the messy, resilient machinery of being human, and when it peeled away the parts beneath were unglamorous and alive. The stranger at the crossroads. It was by accident, an accident the universe would later treat as an initiation, that she met Elias Rowan at an old bus shelter on the edge of town, where the city softened into a landscape of fields and low-slung hills. She had been walking without direction, propelled by an urge to escape the apartment's echoes of what had been hers. Rain had begun to fall, not heavy but persistent, and she pulled the collar of her coat up, hunching into herself like someone learning to keep warmth with less. The bus shelter was lit by a single, buzzing lamp and smelled vaguely of wet paper. He sat there with a bag beside him and a soft smile that did not rush to explain itself. He had the kind of face that seemed to have read 1,000 different maps of the world and decided to fold them into one calm expression. The eyes carried the steady quality of someone who had seen storms and found a way to anchor. Arya's first instinct, one of the old reflexes, was to measure him. Where had he come from? What did his presence mean? Was there a reason his steadiness irritated her so much? The questions were reflexive defenses, the old scaffolding of someone whose respect was purchased by verifying facts and securing references. But Elias only lifted his head and offered her a spare newspaper to ward off the rain, a small kindness that felt less like charity and more like a signal between two people who had both misplaced their umbrellas into life. "You don't have to sit with it all alone," he said without preface, the words coming as if they had been waiting on his tongue for a long time. He did not ask what had happened, and she did not offer an explanation. There are storms that demand to be weathered without being named, and sometimes the presence of another human being is enough to change the weather inside you. He spoke with a voice that was both precise and free, an odd combination that suggested someone who had learned to be careful without constriction. His speech had the story-esque cadence of a teller who understood that life was a series of crossed paths and gentle lessons. When Arya told herself she was merely seeking shelter from the rain, he smiled like a man for whom the weather and life were no separate things. He introduced himself, the name Elias Rowan, as simple and earthy as bark and water, and when Arya, still tight with shame and shock, gave her own name it came out small, as if she had left pieces of herself in the cardboard box she still carried. There was an unhurried honesty in the way he listened. He did not offer immediate platitudes or the kind of tactical advice Arya's mind had been trained to expect from colleagues and career coaches. Instead, he described very ordinary things with tenderness: the architecture of clouds, the way an old sweater remembers a person in its weave, the way a lost thing has a stubborn habit of teaching the finder something essential. It was not that Elias erased her pain. He simply reframed the space around it so that the sharp edges softened enough to be seen. The encounter felt like the hinge of a door she had never noticed, the kind of door that leads out of a room where one has been pacing for years. The invitation to surrender. He said it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world: nothing real is ever lost. The sentence, plucked from the humblest part of his speech, landed like a small, luminous pebble in the center of her chaotic pond. Arya thought at first that he meant the people she loved, or the job titles, or the tidy achievements that had defined her currency. But Elias extended the meaning like the widening of a river. The realness he spoke of was not external. It was the deeper quality of being, the unnameable kernel beneath all versions of self. He was saying, gently and with an earnestness that was not escapist, that the essential parts of us, our core values, the love that shaped us, the way possibility sits in the bone of our dreams, do not collapse when the scaffolding of life does. They take on new forms, perhaps humbler, perhaps stranger, but they remain. This was not consolation so much as a re-education of perception, an invitation to look at loss through a different lens. Arya felt an absurd defiance rising inside her, a reflex to test the assertion by clinging harder, as if to prove him wrong would grant her back some lost control. Instead, she found herself asking a clumsy question, how? And he answered with a story rather than a sermon. He told her about a potter who had lost his favorite tool during a festival and had spent days ransacking his shop in a despair that was equal parts fury and grief. In the end, the potter found that, in the gap left by the lost tool, his hands found a new motion that produced wares of a quality he had never achieved before. The missing tool had not ended his craft, it had changed its grammar. Elias's point did not denigrate the potter's loss, but it refused to let loss be final. It was a lesson in how life rearranges itself when we do not recognize our value by the objects near us. The invitation to surrender, as Elias described it, was not the defeat of resignation but a curious, active yielding. Surrender, he said, is not an abdication, it is the choice to stop directing every moment from fear. He suggested practices that sounded almost embarrassingly small, a 5-minute breath to notice where the body tightens, a ritual of letting go where you write a fear on a paper and burn it as a symbol, the practice of holding an intention and then releasing it to the day. These were not grandiose prescriptions but tiny experiments in training attention away from the tightness of grasping and toward the openness of acceptance. When he spoke, he did not demand immediate trust. He offered practices like keys left on a bench, gentle invitations to try them and see what opened. Arya left that bus shelter with rain cooling the heat behind her ears and a curiosity she could not have named as hope. The phrase, "nothing real is ever lost," followed her like a chorus she could not yet interpret. In the hours and days that followed, she discovered how resistance had been her default posture for survival. It had been effective in small, transactional contests, but ineffective and exhausting when the world asked for a deeper, more patient response. The panic did not disappear at once, it receded in jagged waves, but something about Elias's presence had given Arya a new option. She could be frantic and brittle in the face of change, or she could begin, with small insistence, to practice a different muscle. Narrative reflection. Detachment, as the story will show, does not begin as a lesson learned in a tidy, epiphanic moment. It arrives as a series of tiny shifts that accumulate until one morning you wake and the landscape has altered beneath your feet. The initial collapse, the job lost, the relationship ended, was only the trigger body that forced Arya's attention inward. Most people confuse detachment with indifference, imagining a saintly disengagement devoid of feeling or responsibility, but the truth is more paradoxical. Detachment asks you to feel more fully while refusing to let those feelings calcify into compulsive ownership. In other words, to detach is to be present and engaged without treating outcomes as extensions of your identity. Arya's panic, and the way it multiplied when she attempted to control every variable, illustrates an essential principle. Attachment to fixed outcomes is a form of narrowness, and the mind that insists on narrowness will be worn thin. Control seems like security because it reduces variability, yet life, in its essence, is a convocation of variability. The more energy you devote to resisting the fluid nature of existence, the less energy you reserve for responding intelligently when you are called to adapt. The work of detachment, then, is not to manufacture apathy but to cultivate spaciousness, a capacity to hold loss, to mourn it, and to allow the rawness of experience to transform you without defining you. Elias's invitation to surrender is precisely this. The teacher offers practices not because they fix circumstances but because they rewire attention. Attention, once trained away from constant gripping, begins to notice different possibilities. When you stop designating every moment as mine or not mine, your energy loosens and can be redirected toward creative response rather than defensive reaction. In Arya's case, the collapse of control forced a divergence in her trajectory. She could either double down on frantic repair and risk burning out or learn to practice gentle release and discover new wells of creativity and resilience. The story will follow the latter path because that is what the law of detachment promises, not an immunity to pain but a freedom from its enslaving power. Practical transformation. Elias did not give Arya a 5-step plan. He gave her an invitation to practice presence in small, accessible ways, trusting that repetition, not force, would produce change. When she asked him what to do first, he suggested a simple practice she could perform even in the humblest of places, the 3-breath reset. It was not mystical, it was a discipline that converged physiology and attention. The instruction was to inhale slowly for 4 counts, hold gently for 2, exhale for 6, and repeat 3 times with full attention on sensation. He told her to do this whenever the compulsive urge to fix or control rose, before she fired off an angry email or called Julian, before she let panic run the steering wheel. The result, he promised not as prophecy but as a plausible experiment, was the emergence of a gap between stimulus and reaction. In that gap, choice returns. He also asked her to keep a small notebook, not for plans or to-do lists but for "what changed today" entries, 2 lines at the end of each day noting one thing she had tried to control and how releasing it altered the outcome, if only slightly. The exercise was meant to anchor learning in observation rather than narrative. The notebook would, over time, provide her with a map of subtle shifts she would otherwise forget. Finally, Elias encouraged a ritual of symbolic release. Write one fear or attachment on a page, fold it, and put it in a pocket. At the end of each week, either burn the paper safely or tear it into small pieces and scatter them where the wind could take them. The ritual was not magical. It was practical psychology. It created a tangible act for the invisible inner gesture of letting go. These practices were small and humble, yet they offered a way out of panic by redirecting her energy from control to curiosity. The 3-breath reset created space. The "what changed today" notebook turned intangible learning into recordable data. The weekly release ritual turned the abstract act of surrender into something with muscle memory. Small practices like these, Elias suggested, compound. They do not make you immune to loss, but they make you less likely to be swallowed by it. Closing presence. That night, after the rain and the bus shelter and the brief, luminous conversation with a stranger who was no ordinary man, Arya sat by her window and watched the city lights tremble like a constellation that had forgotten a star. For the first time since the collapse, she did not try to fill the silence with plans. She took 3 slow breaths, not to calm herself only but to become acquainted with a different kind of attention, one that allowed the world to be itself without demanding that it conform to her map. The cardboard box sat in the corner like a small island of her former life, and she folded back the photo of the pier, ran her thumb along the glossy edge, and set it back down without deciding its fate. In the pocket of her coat she placed a small slip of paper and, with surprising steadiness, wrote one single line: "I am willing to see what detachment teaches me." Then she folded the page and put it into her notebook not as an answer but as a promise to experiment. If there is a beginning to the law that governs letting go, it is this: a willingness, not to surrender to despair, but to practice living in a way that does not require the world to validate your worth. The night stretched, and Arya learned to listen to the softer music beneath panic, a subtle, persistent hymn that suggested life would move on, with or without her plans, and that in opening to that movement she might find a freedom she had never sought because she had never imagined leaving the safety of her wall. The collapse of control had done its cruel, necessary work. Now the labor of rebuilding would begin, not with bricks and mortar but with attention, breath, and a steady, curious surrender to what life might teach next.